We continue with our series on electoral justice on a segment we are dubbing Reluctant Conversations, where we choose to wrestle and contend with issues that we're often keen to shy away from, conversations that we're often reluctant to have. Family meeting kind of conversations. The Kenyan family. Let us begin here in this episode. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos and kratia. Demos meaning people or the people, and kratia meaning power or to rule. Together, democracy means rule by the people or people power. Kenya is supposed to be a representative, participatory democracy. The question that begs, if the will of the people is not faithfully captured during elections, is the leadership the true representation of the people? If their exercises in participating, whether in elections or in public participation, suffer from systemic failure, therefore not accurately capturing their voice, ladies and gentlemen, do we have a democracy? Now, to be fair, voting day in Kenya is often a marvel of logistics. Millions of registered voters, each issued with 6 ballot papers for president, governor, senator, MP, women rep, and MCA across almost 50,000 polling stations across the country. All to be done in about 11 hours or less. That's millions of individual votes cast in a single day. Certainly not a trivial undertaking. But within this one intense day, there are countless moving parts where electoral justice can either be secured or lost. This is where the misunderstanding between voting and elections really bites. Most of us think our job is done once we have cast the vote. But actually, the real fight for your vote's integrity escalates after you drop it in the ballot box. And here's what tends to go wrong. One of the cleverest ways to steal an election is no longer by obvious ballot stuffing, which risks detection and violence, like what happened after the Tharaka Nithi results came in 2007, 2008. In contrast, intelligent or clever rigging happens by tiny, barely noticeable manipulations across thousands of polling stations. Change 5 votes here, 10 votes there. Nobody might notice in that polling station. But multiply by hundreds of stations and suddenly you've shifted tens of thousands of votes nationwide. It is death by 1,000 cuts to the people's will. For example, a presiding officer might misrecord the tally on the form by a small margin, or a polling clerk might deliberately declare a few ballots rejected, even if the voter's intention was clear. These little, sometimes imperceptible tricks add up. In a close race, they can swing the result, all while each individual polling station looks normal on the surface. Now, rejected ballots may sound insignificant. After all, they're not counted for anyone. But in large numbers, they indicate something is wrong. It could be voter error, yes, but it could also very well be deliberate sabotage. For instance, a polling clerk might assist an elderly voter or an illiterate voter and accidentally on purpose mark an extra mark on the ballot, making it a rejected ballot. In places without vigilant agents or observers, who would know? Now, allow us to take a moment to make some careful distinctions here especially between rejected votes versus spoiled votes. And there's also a class known as assisted voting, but we'll focus on rejected votes and spoiled votes, which are often hidden but crucial factors that can sway an election. At first glance, a spoiled vote and a rejected vote sound like the same thing. But in law, in Kenyan election law, they're different. And the distinction is important. Spoiled ballots are those ruined before they ever make it into the ballot box. For instance, if you as a voter make a mistake or you tear the paper, you can give it back and ask for a fresh one because you've realized there's a mistake. And that spoiled ballot is given back to polling officials. It shouldn't make it into the ballot box. And you get a fresh one. In short, a spoiled vote is voided during voting and is never placed in the ballot box. In contrast, rejected ballots or rejected votes, sometimes called invalid or null votes, do end up in the ballot box, only to be disqualified during the count because they weren't marked properly according to the rules. And this is determined by the officials. For example, if you were to vote for two candidates on the same ballot paper, or if you leave the ballot paper completely blank, these would be rejected in the tally. However, it's important to note that in some jurisdictions, leaving it blank can be classified as a protest vote, basically saying that you don't deem anyone worthy of being elected, but that doesn't apply in Kenya. So if you vote for two candidates, leave it blank, or you mark outside the box, that's a rejected vote. They count for nobody, but they can still sway an election. How? Rejected ballots are supposed to be counted in the election's turnout, but they don't count towards the winning percentage calculation, the threshold of 50% plus one in a presidential election. What this means is that many people who come out to vote have their voices lost or silenced. If, for example, officials casually tossed ballots or disagreed on what counts as a mark, they could quietly reshape the threshold and the outcome of the election. So each invalid or rejected vote tells a story, either of confusion or mistake, voter education issues, or also sometimes foul play. And thousands of such votes can rewrite history. In the 2013 presidential race, initial results showed an alarming pile of rejected votes comprising over more than 5% of all votes counted. In fact, the rejected votes were almost 400,000. This means that if the rejected votes was a candidate, they would have been number 4. After Uhuru, Raila, and Mudavadi, who garnered just under 500,000 votes. In that election in 2013, all the other 5 candidates combined had just under 230,000 votes. Basically, they had almost half the number of rejected votes. In 2022, the rejected votes would have been number 3 if they were a candidate. What this reveals is how a lack of diligence can snowball into a potential national dilemma. It is a lesson written in statistics. Over 500,000 Kenyan citizens came out to vote only to have their ballots invalidated. A collective voice large enough to alter the course of the presidency and the trajectory of the country. In sum, this often overlooked facets of voting, whether you're talking about spoiled ballots, rejected votes, and even assisted voting, carry tremendous weight. They illustrate that the mechanics of an election are as important as the campaigns themselves. There is what is known as getting out the vote. What we often overlook is protecting the vote. And yet, a nation's leadership hinges on whether ballots are diligently counted or whether citizens can vote freely without needing help that might compromise their intention, or whether election officials will be faithful in identifying the intention of a voter on the ballot paper. History provides chilling examples where the margin of victory was smaller than the number of votes thrown out or dubiously handled, including our own history. This is the sheer gravity behind the terms a single stray mark or a mishandled ballot box can, in aggregate, redirect the destiny of a country. Therefore, ensuring each vote is cast and counted as intended isn't just procedural technicality. It is the very guarantor of the people's voice. Lack of diligence, or worse, deliberate sabotage in these matters can silently steal that voice. Lack of diligence, or worse, deliberate sabotage in these matters can silently steal that voice. And when the voice of the people is subverted, the trajectory of the nation can be irreversibly changed, a reality that every voter should treat with utmost seriousness. Each vote, valid or not, tells a part of the national story, and it is our collective duty to ensure that no voice is casually cast aside or set aside. Now, let us briefly turn our attention to another crucial class of players in the elections. They're known as election agents. On paper, party and candidate agents are the greatest safeguard at polling stations. Their job, to be the eyes and ears of their candidates. They're supposed to witness the voting and the counting and ensure no funny business is taking place, and they're supposed to sign the results form. In the case of a presidential candidate, Form 34A, to confirm it reflects the count. If the agents of all candidates sign off on a result at the station, that result is essentially sealed. It's legally final unless a court finds outright fraud. But here's a catch. Agents are human beings. They can be bribed, they can be intimidated, they can be incompetent, or they can even be absent. Many agents are poorly trained. Some are locals picked a day before. Some even get thrown out of polling stations on flimsy grounds. Others never show up, especially in far-flung remote areas. In past elections, you'd hear arguments like, our agents were denied access, or the form wasn't signed by our agents. Agents are a crucial line of defense, but often a weak link. If they fail to catch an irregularity, or if they themselves collude in it, the polling station is effectively left unguarded. It's like a goalpost without a goalkeeper. Let's use another analogy. Imagine the polling station like a small courtroom. Your presiding officer is a judge. The clerks are the court staff. The agents are the lawyers for each side. And the voters, well, they are the witnesses giving testimony through their votes on who really should win. Now, picture if in a courtroom all the lawyers fell asleep, or if they were kicked out, while the judge had a secret chat with one party, one of the candidates. Would you trust the verdict of that trial? Of course not. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is what can happen in our polling centers, and often does. Kenyans do the voting, but not enough of us stick around to ensure the counting and all the procedures are done right. We come out to cast the vote, brought out by campaign slogans and euphoria, but we do not protect the vote. We do not protect our voice. We vote and go home to watch TV, leaving the courtroom unattended. In that foggy lacuna, that's where the mischief takes root. That's where democracy is compromised. Let us now look at one of the most controversial, misunderstood faces of an election petitions, but this will form the basis of other episodes. This is where our courtrooms come in, especially the Supreme Court for a presidential race, the last bastion of electoral justice. If things go wrong earlier, the last hope are our courts or the streets, but God forbid we go back there ever again after elections. Let's compare two recent key moments, the most recent presidential election petitions. 2017 versus 2022. Two presidential election petitions with opposite outcomes. 2017, this was historic. Baba, Raila Odinga challenged the dynamic duos Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto's re-election, and shockingly, first in Africa, the Supreme Court nullified the presidential election, citing widespread irregularities and illegalities. Chief Justice Emeritus David Maraga and his majority made it clear that an election is a holistic process. And if that process doesn't meet the constitutional standard, the result cannot stand, even if one cannot pinpoint the exact number of votes affected. The court at the time could not be convinced that the integrity of the process was not compromised. The rerun election was ordered to take place within 60 days. And even though that rerun had its own controversies, Baba boycotted, and it had low turnout, the nullification remains instructive to us as a country. as it is still very recent and very relevant history. Now, we are taught not to speak ill of the dead. However, this is factual history pertaining to a public office holder of a very key institution that determined the fate of our country. That is the chair of the IEBC. Chief Justice Emeritus David Maraga delivered a scathing indictment of IEBC chairperson Wafula Chebukati in the Commission's handling of the election. Justice Maraga emphasized that elections aren't merely about numbers, but also, importantly, about adherence to constitutional principles and processes. He famously stated, IEBC failed, neglected, or refused to conduct the presidential election in a manner consistent with the dictates of the Constitution. Regarding Chebukati specifically, Justice Maraga criticized his leadership, questioning his competence and accountability by noting serious irregularities and illegalities in the election process. He underscored the chair's responsibility, emphasizing that the systemic failures occurred under his watch, highlighting inadequacies in transparency, accountability, and procedural compliance. Justice Maraga and the Supreme Court concluded almost dramatically. The irregularities and the illegalities were substantial and significant. They affected the integrity of the election, the results notwithstanding. Process. Not just outcome, but process. Now, although Justice Maraga stopped just shy of explicitly branding the chair personally incompetent, the Supreme Court judgment made it clear that under the then chair's stewardship, the IEBC breached fundamental constitutional requirements, reflecting gravely on his leadership capacity. The implication was clear. The chairperson's handling of the election compromised its integrity, thus rendering the entire process untenable. 2022. Fast forward. 5 turbulent years since Kenya's judiciary had sent shockwaves across Africa by nullifying a presidential election, effectively telling the IEBC chair, you had one job. The Supreme Court of 2017, under Chief Justice Maraga, delivered a bruising verdict, stating plainly that the IEBC had failed, neglected, or refused to deliver a credible election. Yet, astonishingly, the very same chair remained at the helm for the 2022 elections. One might humorously wonder whether electoral competence, like fine wine, improves dramatically over 5 years without any significant institutional overhaul. Or perhaps competence itself is optional in our democratic processes. So, in the 2022 election, another neck-and-neck race, another Supreme Court showdown. But this time, under Chief Justice Martha Koome, the election was upheld unanimously, described with near miraculous certainty as largely beyond reproach. The court didn't merely dismiss Raila Odinga's challenge, it scathingly mocked it, deriding some affidavits as hot air and dismissing claims as wild goose chases, red herrings, and mere hypotheses. The court, it seemed, was not just uninterested, it was positively annoyed, irritated. Curious, isn't it? How an electoral body deemed constitutionally incompetent in 2017 could magically deliver a near flawless election in 2022, despite half the commission, the infamous Cherera 4, publicly disowning the very results Chair Chebukati announced. It's almost as if we went from systemic collapse to electoral sainthood in the blink of an eye. Sure, the Supreme Court assured Kenyans that the late-breaking dysfunction of IEBC commissioners didn't actually affect the numbers, effectively saying, yes, the house was on fire, but don't worry, the furniture survived. They expected irrefutable evidence neatly wrapped and delivered by the same institution whose integrity was under scrutiny. But how precisely does one gather proof from a chaotic, disputed environment, especially when those managing the system are also the gatekeepers of the evidence? What happened in 2022 feels like a judicial whitewash, an extreme makeover episode where a previously condemned institution emerged pristine without any substantial internal reforms. Supporters, some of them today's protesters, celebrated the court's decisiveness. Critics felt betrayed, wondering whether the court itself had become part of a grand national gaslighting experiment. But here's a biting truth, and our primary thesis here at Politically Connected. Elections aren't just about voting. They're about trust, that invisible social fabric. And if trust evaporates at the polling stations or inside tallying centers, no courtroom can manufacture credibility afterwards. By the time you're petitioning judges, as 2022 showed us, the game is largely done. If Kenyans remain passive observers, waiting for judicial salvation after the fact, we might as well rename our electoral process Hope and Pray. Vote fast, question later, and trust blindly the same referees who botched it before. As we've painfully learned, justice delayed isn't justice denied. It's also democracy betrayed.